I found my late husband's bank account with $14 million that I never knew about. A stranger was withdrawing $5,000 from his account every day. When I called the bank and gave his name, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I knew everything about my husband. The way he took his coffee, black, no sugar, always too hot. The sound of his laugh when something genuinely surprised him, that short, almost embarrassed exhale. The smell of his jacket when he came home late from the office. I knew Daniel Mitchell the way you know a house you've lived in for 22 years. Every creak of the floor, every draft in winter, every corner that catches the afternoon light just right. We met in 1999 at a friend's birthday party in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was 31. I was 28. He was quiet in a way that felt like depth rather than absence. Within 6 months, we were living together, and 2 years later, we were married in a small ceremony at my parents' lake house in South Carolina. No drama, no grand gestures, just Daniel and me, and 80 people who loved us, and the smell of pine and lake water. Our life was ordinary in the best possible way. We had a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Charlotte. We had 2 cats, Biscuit and Earl. We had a daughter, Sophie, who was 19 and studying at UNC Chapel Hill. Daniel worked in corporate finance, some kind of consulting firm he'd co-founded with a partner 15 years ago. I was a high school librarian. We weren't rich. We were comfortable. We paid our mortgage, took 1 vacation a year, argued about whose turn it was to call the pest control company. Normal. Safe. Ours. He died on a Tuesday in February. A heart attack. He was 53 years old and apparently perfectly healthy, and then he was gone. The paramedics said it was fast. I've held on to that piece of information like it was a lifeline, though I'm not entirely sure why. Fast. As if speed were a mercy. He was at the office. His assistant found him. By the time I got to the hospital, there was nothing to get to. The weeks after his death exist in my memory as a kind of gray static. I remember Sophie driving down from Chapel Hill and holding my hand for 4 days straight. I remember the funeral, which was large. Daniel had known a lot of people. I remember casseroles arriving at my door and sympathy cards piling up on the kitchen counter, and the specific silence of the house at night that I had never noticed before, because it had always been filled with him. About 3 weeks after the funeral, I started going through his belongings. I wasn't ready, but the practical necessity of it gave me something to do. His clothes, his books, his desk in the small home office where he sometimes worked on weekends, and his phone. I almost didn't look at it. It felt like a violation. Daniel had always kept his phone private, not secretively, just the way some people are about their personal space. I'd never once looked through it in 22 years. But he was gone, and there were practical things I needed. Contacts for his business associates, his insurance documents, passwords for accounts I didn't know about. I charged it, entered the PIN, Sophie's birthday, which I'd watched him set years ago, and started scrolling. The insurance documents were there, the contacts, a half-finished grocery list that made me cry for 10 minutes because it said coffee, the dark roast Claire likes. And then I found the banking app. It wasn't one of our banks. It wasn't Wells Fargo, where we had our joint checking and savings. It wasn't the Fidelity account for his retirement fund. It was an app I'd never seen, branded in dark green and gray, with a name I didn't recognize. Meridian Private Banking. I almost closed it. I almost told myself it was probably some old account he'd forgotten about, maybe a few $100s he'd never bothered to transfer. But I didn't close it. I tapped it open. The balance loaded slowly. My Wi-Fi was bad that morning. The router was in the other room, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with my third cup of coffee going cold beside me. The numbers appeared digit by digit. $14,231,416. I stared at the screen for so long that it went dark, and I had to touch it again. $14 million. In a bank account I had never heard of, in my husband's name, at an institution I had never encountered in 22 years of marriage. I sat very still. Outside, a car passed. The refrigerator hummed. Biscuit jumped onto the table and butted his head against my elbow, and I barely felt it. Then I saw the transaction history. Every single day for the past 4 months, going back to October, more than 3 months before Daniel died. The same withdrawal. $5,000. Transferred out. The recipient field showed only a routing number and the initials. MW every day, 7 days a week, for 119 days. $595,000. Gone. And it was still happening. Even after Daniel's death, the withdrawals had continued. There had been one just this morning at 6:47 a.m., while I was still asleep, while I was still a widow who had no idea this money existed. My hands were shaking when I dialed the number on the back of the app. A customer service line listed in the app's settings. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I expected to feel foolish, to have some banker explain to me that this was a business escrow account and everything was in order. Maybe I was hoping for that. Meridian Private Banking. This is Rachel. How can I assist you today? Hi, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. My name is Claire Mitchell. My husband, Daniel Mitchell, passed away 3 weeks ago. I've just discovered an account in his name at your bank. A private account. I'm calling because someone is still withdrawing $5,000 a day from it, and I need to know who authorized that. I need to know who MW is. A pause. A short, careful pause that told me everything and nothing at once. Mrs. Mitchell, Rachel said slowly, I'm going to need to transfer you to our estate management division. Please hold. And as the hold music began, a generic, placid piano loop that felt grotesque under the circumstances, I realized my life had just split in two. There was everything before that moment and everything that was about to come after it. I didn't know yet how dark that after was going to get. They kept me on hold for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the timer on my phone screen, counting upward while the piano music looped. By the time a man named Gerald Haynes from the estate management division picked up, my coffee was completely cold, and I had moved from the kitchen table to the back porch without fully remembering doing it. Gerald was professionally cautious in a way that felt rehearsed. He confirmed that a Daniel Mitchell did hold an account at Meridian Private Banking. He confirmed that the account was active. He could not, he explained in the smoothest possible tone, discuss the details of any authorized transactions or the identity of any third-party payees without proper documentation of my status as the account's legal heir. He would need a certified death certificate, proof of marriage, and a letter from a probate attorney before he could release any further information. He was very sorry for my loss. He hoped I had a good day. He hung up. I stood on the back porch in the cold February air in my robe and socks, and I thought, someone is draining $14 million from my dead husband's secret account, and the bank is asking me for paperwork. I went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table again, and for the first time since Daniel died, I didn't cry. I made a list. It's strange what grief does to a person. For 3 weeks, I'd been barely functional. Showering when Sophie reminded me, eating in small mechanical bites, sleeping in 4-hour fragments. But sitting there with a legal pad and a pen, with something concrete and wrong and quantifiable in front of me, I felt something shift, not peace, not even clarity. More like a cold, narrow focus, the kind that comes when the body decides that falling apart is a luxury it can no longer afford. What did I actually know? I knew Daniel had a private banking account I'd never heard of, holding over $14 million. I knew someone with the initials MW had been withdrawing $5,000 every day for at least 4 months, including the months Daniel was still alive and including every day since his death. I knew Daniel had never told me this money existed. I knew that $14 million did not appear out of nowhere. It had a source. It had a history. And it had, apparently, a purpose that Daniel had deliberately kept hidden from me. I sat with that last thought for a long time. 22 years. I had believed, without question or reservation, that I knew this man. We had a joint account. We'd filed taxes together every April. We'd sat across from a financial advisor 4 years ago and talked about retirement, and at no point, not once, had Daniel mentioned a $14 million private account. That kind of secret is not an accident. That is a choice, made deliberately, sustained consistently, over years. What else didn't I know? I wrote that question down and underlined it twice. Then I started calculating. $5,000 a day, every day, with no apparent end. If the withdrawals continued at the current rate, the account would be fully drained in approximately 7 years and 8 months. But that was assuming MW, whoever that was, intended to be patient. They might not be. With Daniel dead, there might be nothing stopping them from simply emptying the account all at once. The $5,000 daily limit might be imposed by the bank. It might be circumvented. I had no way of knowing. What I did know was that every day I spent being cautious was another $5,000 walking out the door. Sophie called that afternoon to check on me. I told her I was fine, just sorting through some paperwork. I hated lying to her, but I wasn't ready to explain what I'd found. Partly because I didn't understand it well enough myself, and partly because I was afraid of what her questions might make me say out loud. Your father had a secret. I don't know how big it is. I don't know how long it's been there. I don't know who he was. After I hung up, I searched for probate attorneys in Charlotte. I made an appointment with a woman named Patricia Okafor for 2 days later. I chose her because her bio mentioned 15 years of experience in estate disputes and financial litigation, because her firm's reviews mentioned her as tenacious, and because she had a direct, no-nonsense headshot that I found oddly reassuring. Then I did something that surprised me, something I hadn't planned. I opened my laptop and I started searching for Meridian Private Banking, not the customer service number. I already had that. I searched for the institution itself, its registration, its regulatory filings. It took me about 40 minutes of digging through banking commission records before I found something interesting. Meridian Private Banking was a legitimate institution, small, boutique, federally registered, but it specialized, according to its filings, in accounts for high-net-worth individuals seeking discretionary wealth management. Its client base was, by design, private, and among its listed officers, people who sat on the oversight board, was a name I recognized: Marcus Webb, M.W., the man who was withdrawing $5,000 a day from my dead husband's account, was on the board of the very bank that held it. I closed the laptop. I pressed my hands flat against the kitchen table and breathed. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a forgotten account or some outdated business arrangement Daniel had simply never gotten around to mentioning. This was a system. Someone had built it deliberately. Someone who had access, authority, and a very long head start. And now they were going to find out that Daniel Mitchell's wife was not going to sit quietly in her robe and wait for her husband's secrets to drain away $5,000 at a time. I had 2 days until my appointment with Patricia Okafor. I was going to use every hour of them. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the Charlotte skyline that on another day I might have found beautiful. She was 50-something, with close-cropped natural hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of steady, unhurried manner that cost about $400 an hour and was worth every cent. I laid everything on her desk, my notes, a printed copy of what I'd found about Meridian private banking, Daniel's phone, still charged, still logged into the account, and my 22-year marriage certificate. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at me for a moment. "How much do you want?" she asked. "I don't understand the question." "Some clients come in wanting to understand," she said. "Some want to negotiate, some want to fight. Those are 3 very different strategies, and they produce 3 very different outcomes. Which one are you?" I didn't hesitate. "I want everything that's legally mine, all of it." She put her glasses back on. "Then let's start with what you actually have." What I had, Patricia explained, was potentially significant but procedurally complicated. As Daniel's spouse, I had strong legal standing as his heir. North Carolina was an equitable distribution state, and assets accumulated during a marriage were generally considered marital property regardless of whose name they were in. The $14 million, if it had been earned or accumulated during our marriage, very likely belonged, at least in part, to me. But there were complications. First, the source of the funds was unknown. If the money came from illegal activity, it could be subject to seizure before I could ever claim it. Second, the daily withdrawals to Marcus Webb were ongoing, and stopping them would require a court order, a temporary injunction, which meant filing immediately before more money disappeared. Third, Marcus Webb's position on the board of Meridian Private Banking was a significant problem because it meant he potentially had institutional access to the account that could allow him to move or obscure funds faster than a court order could catch them. "I need you to file for that injunction today," I said. Patricia nodded slowly. "I'll file this afternoon, but I need you to understand, the moment we do this, the other side will know. If Marcus Webb has the kind of access you're describing, he will be notified. This is not a quiet move." "Good," I said. She looked at me again with that same measured steadiness. "Mrs. Mitchell, before we proceed, I have to ask you something. Have you considered the possibility that there are other parties involved? That this account and whatever it was funding may connect to people and interests beyond Marcus Webb?" I had considered it. I'd lain awake considering it for 2 nights. "Yes. And?" "File the injunction," I said. She filed it that afternoon. By evening, I had a text message from a number I didn't recognize. No greeting, no signature, just 7 words. "You don't know what you're getting into." I screenshot it, forwarded it to Patricia, and blocked the number. The next morning, Patricia called me with something unexpected. While preparing the injunction filing, her paralegal had run a deeper search on Meridian Private Banking's regulatory history. 3 years ago, the bank had been subject to a federal audit. A quiet one, never publicized, resolved with a fine rather than prosecution. The audit had been triggered by a suspicious activity report related to large recurring private transfers that flagged a pattern consistent with what regulators called structured financial concealment. The audit had been resolved. The fine had been paid. The case had been closed. But the name of the compliance officer who had signed off on the resolution, the person at the bank who had certified that the suspicious activity had been explained and was legitimate, was Daniel Mitchell, my husband. My hands went cold when Patricia told me. "He wasn't just an account holder," I said. "No," Patricia said carefully. "It appears he may have been involved in the bank's operations in some capacity, possibly as a consultant, possibly in a more formal role. We don't know yet. But Claire, this changes the scope of what we're looking at. This isn't just an undisclosed marital asset. This may be evidence of financial misconduct that your husband was party to." I sat down on the edge of my bed. Through the window, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. 2 kids riding bikes, a woman walking a golden retriever. The ordinary Sunday morning world that had no idea I was sitting in my bedroom, discovering that the man I'd slept beside for 22 years had helped a private bank cover up a federal audit. "Does this hurt my claim to the money?" I asked. "Not necessarily," Patricia said. "Assets accumulated through misconduct can still be claimed by an innocent spouse who had no knowledge of the activity. But it does mean we need to be careful. And it means the other side, Marcus Webb and whoever else is involved, they have significantly more to lose than we initially understood. Which meant they were going to fight harder. I understood that. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I understood it completely. And I was not afraid, in the way I think they expected me to be. I was angry. Not at Patricia. Not at the federal system or the bank or the regulatory fine paid 3 years ago. I was angry at Daniel. Quietly, enormously, structurally, angry at the man who had shared my bed and my table and my life and had apparently kept a whole other architecture running beneath it. That anger, I realized, was not a weakness. It was an engine. "What's the next step?" I asked. "We request the full account history from Meridian under the estate claim," Patricia said, "and then we subpoena Marcus Webb." "Do it," I said. "All of it." I was past the point of turning back. I'm not sure I had ever really been at that point to begin with. The subpoena for Marcus Webb was served on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I had a voicemail from a man I'd never spoken to before. Not Marcus Webb, but a lawyer named Stuart Farrell, who introduced himself as representing a consortium of interests related to the Meridian private banking estate matter. His tone was smooth, in the way that expensive people who want something from you are always smooth. He said he believed there was an opportunity for a productive conversation before this proceeded to litigation. He left a number and asked me to call at my earliest convenience. I forwarded the voicemail to Patricia and did not call back. Patricia, meanwhile, had obtained something significant through the estate claim process. Meridian Private Banking, under legal obligation and with the injunction temporarily blocking further withdrawals, had been compelled to produce a partial transaction summary for Daniel's account. It covered the last 14 months. Patricia reviewed it overnight and called me Friday morning. "The account has been active for at least 8 years, she said. "The summary we received only covers 14 months, but the starting balance for that period indicates prior activity going back much further. Funds were deposited in structured increments, always just under $10,000 at a time, which is the federal reporting threshold, and they came from multiple source accounts, all of them registered to a single LLC called Webb Meridian Capital Advisors. That's Marcus Webb's company. It is, and Daniel was listed as a silent partner. Silent partner. I stood in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and looked at the coffee maker that still sat on the same counter where it had sat for 11 years. And I thought about what a silent partner meant. It meant Daniel had known. It meant Daniel had chosen. It meant that for however long this had been running, 8 years, maybe more, he had collected his share and said nothing and come home every evening and sat across from me at dinner and talked about whatever was on television and said nothing, nothing, nothing. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart about that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That Friday evening, as I was eating dinner alone, soup from a can, which was what my appetite had come down to, someone knocked at my front door. Not the casual knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and hard. I looked through the peephole. 2 men I'd never seen before stood on my porch, both in their 40s, both in dark jackets, both with the particular stillness of men who are accustomed to making other people uncomfortable. I did not open the door. "Mrs. Mitchell," one of them said, loud enough to carry through the door, "my name is Thomas Greer. I work for Marcus Webb. He'd like to extend an invitation to discuss the current situation privately before the legal process becomes something that's unpleasant for everyone." "You can contact my attorney," I said through the door. A pause. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think it would be worth your time to understand the full picture of your husband's activities before you proceed any further. Some of that information could be damaging to his memory, to his reputation, to how your daughter remembers him." There it was. I felt the threat land like a stone in still water. That cold, spreading weight. They were telling me, back off, or we'll drag Daniel's name through everything we know about him, and your daughter will lose the father she thought she had. It was a real threat. It was the kind of threat that works on people who love someone enough to protect even their dead reputation. And I will admit, standing in my hallway with my hand against the door and my heart going very fast, that I felt the pull of it. The part of me that had loved Daniel for 22 years wanted to say stop, enough, leave him in peace. But the part of me that had been left with a mortgage and a pension and a school librarian's salary, while $14 million sat in a secret account with a stranger's initials, taking a piece of it every single day, that part was harder. "You have my attorney's number," I said. "If you knock on this door again without an appointment, I will call the police." A long silence, then footsteps, retreating across the porch. I called Patricia immediately. She filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office the next morning, documenting the visit as intimidation. She also sent a cease and desist to Stuart Farrell, Marcus Webb's lawyer, explicitly prohibiting further direct contact with me. The response came within 4 hours. A counterfiling from Farrell suggesting that my estate claim was based on fraudulent intent, that I had known about the account, and that I was attempting to seize assets that were subject to prior legitimate business agreements. It was a lie. All of it was a lie. But lies filed in court documents cost time and money and emotional energy to disprove, and that was the point. I took the weekend. I know that might sound like weakness, taking 2 days when money was still moving, when lawyers were filing things, when men in dark jackets had been on my porch. But Patricia told me that the injunction was holding, the withdrawals were frozen, and there was nothing operationally I could do before Monday that would change the legal landscape. And I needed to be functional. Grief and shock and legal battle together make a weight that can crush a person if they don't set it down for 48 hours and breathe. I drove to the lake house. My parents had left it to me 5 years ago. It was small and not particularly warm in February, but it was quiet, and it smelled like pine and cold water, and I had grown up there. Sophie drove down and spent Saturday with me. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. But I told her enough that there were financial complications in the estate, that I was handling them, that I was okay. She held my hand the way she had in those first days. She was so much braver than I gave her credit for. By Sunday evening, I was back in Charlotte, cleaner, steadier, ready. The following week, Stuart Farrell's office sent a formal settlement proposal. It was generous on its surface. Marcus Webb, through his attorney, was offering me a lump sum payment of $1.8 million in exchange for a full release of my estate claim on the Meridian account, a non-disclosure agreement covering all details of the matter, and a signed statement confirming that I had no further legal interest in any business arrangements connected to Daniel Mitchell's professional activities. Patricia brought the proposal to me in person, which told me she considered it serious enough to discuss face-to-face. We sat in her office on the 14th floor with the Charlotte skyline behind her and the offer on the desk between us. $1.8 million. Against my school librarian's salary and my joint savings account, and my modest pension and the mortgage I was now covering alone, $1.8 million was a number that could genuinely change my life. Pay off the house, fund Sophie's education without loans, let me retire early or change careers or simply breathe without calculating. I looked at the number for a long time. They're not offering me what I'm legally owed, I said. They're offering me what they calculate is just enough to make this go away. Patricia nodded. $1.8 million represents roughly 12% of the account's current value. It is, as you say, a strategic offer, not an equitable one. If I take it, I sign a non-disclosure. Yes, you would be permanently prohibited from discussing any aspect of Daniel's involvement with Meridian, Marcus Webb, or Webb Meridian Capital Advisors. Which means whatever they built together, whatever fraud or misconduct or financial scheme ran for 8 years, stays buried. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. That is a very real implication of the agreement, yes. I picked up the proposal. I read it again, slowly, all 5 pages of it. There was language in it that called the settlement a goodwill gesture in recognition of Mrs. Mitchell's personal circumstances. Goodwill, as though Marcus Webb was doing me a favor, as though $14 million that had run through a system my husband helped build and protect was a gift being offered rather than a debt being minimized. I set it back down. No, I said. Patricia didn't look surprised. I want to make sure you've considered... I've considered it, I said. If I take this, Marcus Webb walks away clean. The bank walks away clean. Whatever this money actually is, wherever it actually came from, it all stays in the dark. And I sign my name to keeping it there. I folded my hands on the desk. I won't do that. Not for $1.8 million, not for $14 million. What I want is the full legal truth of what that account is and what I'm legitimately owed from it, and I want it through a court of law where it's on the record. All right, Patricia said simply. We declined the offer formally that afternoon. What I didn't tell Patricia, what I barely admitted to myself, was that the offer had frightened me more than the men on the porch, because the men on the porch were a threat I could refuse physically, with a locked door and a phone call to the sheriff. But $1.8 million was a temptation aimed at the part of me that was tired and scared and alone, and those were harder to close a door against. The fact that I'd managed to close it anyway told me something about myself, something useful. I found my support that week from an unexpected source. My neighbor, Donna Aldrich, had lived 3 houses down from us for 12 years. She was 64, recently retired, a former paralegal, Not a lawyer, she always clarified, but she had worked in family law for 26 years and understood civil proceedings the way someone who has spent decades in the room tends to. We'd always been friendly without being close, the kind of neighbors who wave and occasionally share produce from the garden and stop to chat about nothing in particular. She knocked on my door on a Wednesday morning with a container of homemade soup and a direct expression that told me she wasn't there just for neighborly reasons. "I've been noticing some things," she said when I let her in. "The men who came to your door, the legal notices I've seen being delivered. I know it's not my business, but if you need someone to sit with you through this, not as a legal advisor, just as a person who's been in legal offices long enough to understand what's happening, I'm available." I looked at her for a moment. Then I invited her to sit down, and I told her almost everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she poured us both soup and said, "Good. Don't take the settlement, and don't let them convince you that going to court makes you the difficult one." For the first time in weeks, I felt less alone in a practical, grounded way. Not the soft consolation of grief support, but the specific comfort of having someone in your corner who understood the terrain. Donna became my second person, my anchor outside of Patricia's office. She didn't have legal standing in my case. She was clear about that, but she had clarity and experience, and she wasn't frightened of Marcus Webb or Stuart Farrell or anyone else who sent proposals designed to make a widow feel small. I watched, during those days, as the legal machinery continued to turn. Marcus Webb had gone quiet. No more proxies at my door, no more voicemails from Farrell beyond official correspondence. But Patricia told me not to mistake quiet for retreat. "They're watching," she said. "They want to see if you're going to break." I wasn't. He came in person on the first Saturday of March. Marcus Webb was 61, silver-haired, and wore the kind of quiet, expensive confidence that comes from decades of being the smartest person in whatever room he chose to enter. He arrived at my door at 11 in the morning, alone, without a lawyer, carrying nothing except a slight smile and 30 years of practice at controlling conversations. I was surprised enough by his audacity that I almost didn't answer. Then I thought about the fact that I'd been building toward a confrontation with this man for weeks, and that opening the door and looking him in the eye was an entirely different kind of preparation. I opened it. "Claire," he said, as though we were old acquaintances, "thank you for seeing me." "I haven't agreed to see you," I said. "You're standing on my porch without an appointment." "I know. I apologize for that. I wanted to speak with you honestly, without lawyers in the room making everything more adversarial than it has to be." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "May I come in? 15 minutes." I let him in. I want to be honest about why. Not because I trusted him, but because I wanted to hear what he said when he thought he was winning. I did not offer him coffee. I sat in the armchair across the living room from the couch, which left a deliberate distance between us, and I waited. He looked around the room with an expression I could only describe as proprietary, as though he were seeing something he had some claim to. "Daniel was my partner for 11 years, he said. "Not just a business partner, a genuine friend. I want you to know that his death was a loss to me, too." "I'm sure," I said. "I understand you're angry. I think, in your position, I would be angry too. To discover that someone you loved kept significant financial information from you, that's a real wound, and I don't dismiss it." He leaned forward slightly. "But Claire, what you're doing, pursuing this through the courts, making this public, it won't give you answers about Daniel. It won't explain why he made the choices he made. It will only damage whatever remains of his reputation and create a public record of things that are going to hurt you and your daughter. There it was again. Sophie. He'd brought Sophie into it because he'd calculated, correctly, I'll give him that my daughter was the pressure point. The account, I said, is listed in Daniel's name. I am his legal heir. The money in that account is subject to estate law. Whatever arrangements existed between Daniel and you, regardless of their nature, the legal succession of that asset is a matter for the courts, not for an 11 a.m. visit to my living room. He tilted his head. Claire, the money in that account it's not simply money. It represents years of structured agreements between multiple parties. Daniel understood that. He knew there were obligations attached to that capital that extended beyond his estate. His voice was still measured, almost gentle. If this goes to court, those agreements are going to become part of the record. The origin of those funds is going to become part of the record. And I have to be honest with you, some of that is going to look very bad for Daniel. You already threatened me with Daniel's reputation, I said. Through 2 men on my porch 3 weeks ago. A flicker across his face. Not embarrassment. Marcus Webb didn't embarrass easily, but recalibration. He hadn't expected me to name it directly. That was handled poorly, he said. I apologize for that. And the settlement offer, I said. 1.8 million non-disclosure, full release of claims. That was your idea of a fair resolution. It was a starting point. It was an insult, I said. It was calculated to be just enough to make a grieving widow feel like she was getting something while you kept everything else and kept it quiet. I looked at him steadily. I declined it. I'm declining whatever you've come here to offer today. I want you to leave my house. Something changed in his face then. The smoothness didn't vanish entirely. Men like Marcus Webb don't lose their composure in living rooms, but the warmth behind it did. What was left was something colder and more accurate. You're making a very costly mistake, he said, and his voice had dropped half a register. Not for me, for yourself. You don't have the full picture, Claire, and by the time you do, it's going to be too late to make a different choice. My attorney will be in touch through proper channels, I said. I'd like you to leave now. He left. He walked out of my house and down my front steps and got into a black car waiting at the curb, and he didn't look back. I stood in the middle of my living room and felt something I didn't expect. Fear. Not the abstract, pervasive fear of the past weeks, but specific and physical. A cold current running through my chest and into my hands. He had come here. He had sat on my couch. He had said costly mistake in a voice that had the particular weight of a man who means what he says. And then, and this is what I've tried to explain to people since, and what I think is the hardest thing to understand from the outside, that fear didn't make me want to stop. It made me want to run faster, because Marcus Webb had been comfortable for a very long time. He had never once, I suspected, had to sit in someone else's house and use the word please. The fact that he'd come here, done this himself, abandoned the distance of lawyers and proxies to sit on my couch and speak directly to me, that told me something. He was scared too, and a frightened man who has everything to lose is far more dangerous than a confident one. But he is also, I would discover, more likely to make mistakes. I called Patricia that afternoon and told her every word he'd said. She recorded my account on file, added it to the documentation, and told me, he just handed us something. If he approaches you again without counsel present, we can move for a restraining order. I know, I said. I was ready for what came next. The hearing was scheduled for the 14th of April in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse on East Trade Street. By that point, 10 weeks had passed since I'd found the app on Daniel's phone. Patricia and her team had built a case file 3 inches thick, partial transaction records from Meridian, Daniel's signature on the federal audit resolution, documentation of structured deposits, always just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, and financial forensic analysis characterizing the pattern as consistent with layered fund concealment. We also had something Marcus Webb had not anticipated. 3 weeks before the hearing, Patricia had subpoenaed the records of Webb Meridian Capital Advisors. Among those records was an operating agreement dated 2015 naming 3 managing partners, Marcus Webb, Daniel Mitchell, and a woman called Elena Reyes. Through public records, I found her professional biography, her industry presence, and a 2018 newsletter photograph of her standing beside Daniel at a financial conference in Atlanta, both of them smiling in the way of people who are comfortable together. I showed it to Donna at my kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment, then said, "Does this change what you're doing?" "No," I said. "Good," she said. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Dark blue dress, low heels, my good coat. When I walked into the courtroom, Marcus Webb and Elena Reyes were already seated at the opposing counsel's table. She did not look at me. He looked at me once quickly and looked away. The judge was the Honorable Sandra Booker, efficient, unimpressible, experienced. Farrell opened for the defense, arguing that the funds were not marital assets but capital held in trust under legitimate private business arrangements, and that my estate claim mischaracterized the account's legal status. He used the word unfortunate twice. Then Patricia stood up. She laid out without theatrics the documented evidence, structured deposits, the 8-year timeline, Daniel's audit signature, the operating agreement naming all 3 partners, and the forensic analysis. Then she said, "We are notifying the court that we have referred these materials to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina for review." The room went quiet in a specific way, a tightening quiet like air being drawn out. I watched Marcus Webb. He didn't move, but his jaw changed in a barely visible tightening, the tell of a man whose contingencies have just run out. Elena Reyes's hand slid from the table into her lap. Her separate attorney leaned in and said something quickly into her ear. Farrell maintained in an admirably controlled voice that his client was confident any review would confirm all activity was fully legal. Judge Booker looked at him with the expression of someone who has formed a realistic view of what confidence implies. The court will continue the account injunction and order full documentary production from Webb Meridian Capital Advisors within 30 days. She then added, in the same temperate voice, "I would strongly encourage your clients to consider the full scope of their legal exposure before deciding how they wish to proceed." "Full scope of their legal exposure," said calmly, in a courthouse on East Trade Street on a Tuesday afternoon in April. When I walked out into the sunlight, I was not triumphant. The case was far from over, but I was calm in the specific way of someone who has stopped wondering whether the ground will hold and has found that it does. What followed was, legally speaking, a cascade. The months between the hearing and the final resolution were full of procedural filings and the grinding exhaustion of litigation that moves on legal time rather than human time. But the momentum was ours, and it did not reverse. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened a formal investigation in May. The full documentary production from Webb Meridian, delivered in June, showed 8 years of structured deposits from a network of shell entities, registered in Delaware, Nevada, and 2 offshore jurisdictions, funneled through Web Meridian into the Meridian account, always just below the federal reporting threshold. The system had been designed by all 3 managing partners, Marcus Webb, Elena Reyes, and Daniel Mitchell. My husband had not been a passive participant. He had been an architect. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. What hurt was not the money or the legal exposure. It was the smaller thing, that he had looked at me every day and decided I was someone to conceal things from. I was allowed to be angry about that. I was. Marcus Webb negotiated a civil settlement in August under advice from his criminal attorney, who had apparently made clear that cooperation would be viewed favorably by federal investigators. The settlement covered the full remaining account balance. My share, after legal fees and federal forfeiture deductions, was $9.3 million. Legally, documentably, adjudicated mine. Elena Reyes did not settle. That was her most significant mistake. She fought the civil case while declining to cooperate with the federal investigation, and the combination proved catastrophic. In September, she was named in a federal indictment on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering and structuring. Her assets were frozen. Marcus Webb, who had cooperated, pleaded guilty to a single reduced count and received 18 months in federal prison, supervised release, and a civil fine of $4.2 million. Meridian Private Banking surrendered its federal charter and ceased operations in November. Daniel could not be prosecuted. He was dead, and the law cannot reach the dead. His role became part of the public record, referenced in the indictment, the settlement documentation, and financial news coverage of the case. I didn't put it there. His choices did. All I did was refuse to keep them buried. Sophie found out everything in stages over several months. She was devastated. She was angry. She sat with it. And then she said, "Dad made bad choices. That doesn't change that you fought for what was right. I want you to have that money, Mom. You earned it more than anyone." I signed the settlement papers in Patricia Okafor's office on a September afternoon. Charlotte gleamed through the window behind her. She slid the folder across the desk and I signed my name, Claire Mitchell. On the line at the bottom, $9.3 million. The full documented truth. No non-disclosure, no goodwill gesture, no quiet resolution in someone else's favor. Mine. I moved in January. Not far. I didn't want to go far. I'd lived in North Carolina for most of my adult life, and the state felt like mine in a way that no amount of money was going to relocate. But I left the house in the Charlotte suburb with its familiar creaking floors and its ghost of a marriage I was still learning to understand. I bought a smaller house near a lake farther north, with a wide porch and pine trees that come almost to the water's edge. It is very quiet there in the mornings. I've started running again, something I'd given up in my early 40s. Now I run along the lake path before the sun is fully up, and I've found that my knees were not the problem. Time was. I have more of it now. I left the high school library. That sounds like a loss, and in some ways it is. I love the particular work of putting the right book into the right teenager's hands at the right moment. But a small nonprofit in Asheville that connects underserved rural communities with mobile library services asked whether I'd be interested in joining their board. One conversation became another. I am now their director of programming, working part-time and remotely, bringing library access to mountain communities that have never had a branch of their own. It is more meaningful than anything I've done professionally in a long time. Sophie finished her degree and is now working in Raleigh at an environmental consulting firm. She comes to the lake house once a month, sometimes more. We cook together and sit on the porch and watch the sun go down over the water, and we've developed the particular language of two people who have survived something together. Honesty, shorthand, the ability to say difficult things without ceremony. She doesn't talk about her father often. When she does, I don't stop her. She is allowed to grieve him and be angry at him simultaneously. I know that better than anyone. I have not remarried. What I have built is something I don't yet have an adequate word for. Not solitude, which implies absence, but a deliberate and comfortable independence I didn't know I was capable of. I make decisions about my house, my schedule, and my money without consulting anyone, and I find that I am very good at it. I have a garden. Biscuit and Earl are still with me, elderly and imperious, alongside a younger pair named Reed and Sable, who knock things off shelves with the confident authority of creatures who have never been told no. I cook better than I used to. I sleep well, which for a long time I did not. Marcus Webb entered federal prison the following April and served 14 months before release on supervised release. I read the brief notice one morning over coffee and set it down without particular feeling. He had lost his reputation, his business, his freedom for a time, and much of his wealth. Elena Reyes went to trial. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. 8 years of structured transactions, her own signature on operating agreements, communications showing her full awareness of the concealment strategy. She was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and permanent revocation of her professional licenses. The career she had spent 15 years building is gone. She made choices. She is living with them. Donna Aldrich has taken up watercolor painting and sends me photographs of her work. They are, genuinely, quite good. Patricia Okafor made partner at her firm. I sent flowers. She sent a brief, warm, dignified note. And me? On the mornings when I stand on my porch, watching the mist come off the lake in the early light, I am something closer to at peace. Not the peace of someone who has forgotten, but of someone who survived, who fought, and who built something worth waking up to. I didn't know I could do that. Now I know. What would you have done? Sitting at that kitchen table with a number on a phone screen that rewrote 22 years. I genuinely want to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me whether you would have signed that settlement. Tell me whether you would have opened that door. And if this story reached you, if any part of it felt real, please share it with someone. You never know who needs to hear that fighting back is possible. Thank you for listening to the very end. It means more than I can say.